causality seems to be a pretty big thing. And to say that we make any choice, like free will choice, that's like independent of our prior causation, is I don't know how you can ever justify that without bringing in magic or religion. So if we believe in that, we lose our ability to kind of like be treated as moral agents or to make statements about whether an action was good or bad. Teleporting is awesome. Okay, well, hold on. I don't want to be teleported around because I'm basically dying. If I get teleported, I'm being fucking killed. But then like my next level of thought is being teleported would be no different than falling asleep and waking up. Because if you fall asleep and you pause your conscious experience and you wake up, it might actually be the case that when I go to sleep every night, I'm actually experiencing death. Whatever my current experience is ends and it's essentially dying. And then when I wake up the next morning, kind of like a new conscious experience is taking over. So for instance, let's say that I go to sleep at night and somebody picks me up and carries me into the living room and sets me on the couch and I wake up on the couch. Or let's say that I go to sleep at night and I'm teleported to the couch. My original is destroyed and a copy is teleported onto the couch. There might be a physical difference, but would I ever know? One thing that is actually really frustrating to me, I don't know, maybe this relates to the neural net study, is it's really, really, really hard to say what thing caused another thing. I've backed off of these statements so much in the past 5 years. Like if you would have asked me when I was 25, like, oh, like, why are you the way you are? I would have very confidently said like, oh, well, I think it's because this in my childhood and this and blah, 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 you know, and this and that and that. But like, if you're really honest with yourself, it's really hard to say why something is the way that it is. You know, like maybe you're a certain way because of this, but maybe it was something totally unrelated. And it was like a confluence of like 5 seemingly unrelated things that actually make you the way that you are. And it's so hard to say. The inability to know exactly is something that's very frustrating to me. I bring this up in relation to like, so for instance, like I say that I am non-binary and I don't really care if I'm like a man or that doesn't make it, but maybe I actually do. Maybe that is something that's really important to me. And if I was a woman, maybe that would bother me. Or maybe if I, you know, like it's impossible to know because it's kind of like, in a way it's your experience. You can kind of guess at it, but you know, like who knows?
I'd be curious. I don't know if you know, but the people that currently identify as non-binary, what were their past identities, you know, gender identities, if they had one? Because it would be interesting, for example, if you as a man, as someone that identified as male,
Go ahead.
yeah, sorry, someone that identified as male and now identifies as non-binary, if that is easier for you to somehow do because of, say, misogyny or other sort of sexist ideas that exist in society that make it more difficult for someone that identifies as female to be coming out as non-binary, maybe. Like maybe we place, as a society, at least a Western society, we place more restrictions on the identity of female identity than male identity, potentially. But I don't know.
Yeah, and all of those issues are so macro. It makes it hard to tell anything. Everything is so complicated. I hate, yeah, it's also macro. It's also macro. It's like economics, right? There's like a million fucking variables and you're not really allowed to experiment. You know, you can't raise children a certain way and find out how they turn out. Like that's pretty fucked up. So you can only do like retrospectives and stuff, which have a whole host of other problems. But yeah, like when you look at things, for instance, like how many trans people there are in society, you know, like these numbers are increasing. It's like, well, are the numbers increasing or is it just being diagnosed more often? Or are there people that are just more confident or comfortable coming out as it? Or is it the fact that there are people that are more confident coming out with it is causing other people to come out with it? Or like, there's like a million things, you know, that, or like, is society creating like a certain expectation or something somehow? Or like all of these things are so hard to know the answer to. Or like when it comes to things like ADHD or depression or ASD, autism spectrum disorder, like it's so hard. Like, where is the correlation? Where is the causation? Like, what the fuck is making what happen for what thing? You know?
Right. I'm curious. I just thought of this. You identify as bisexual and non-binary, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, is that an expression of your, you know, just not knowing about, you know, or not agreeing to the fact that it can be known about someone's discrete gender or sexual preferences?
I think this is going to sound like very memey, but I think that, honest to God, I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about like sexuality and what turns me on in certain scenarios, that I've just kind of disassociated it from like gendered stuff. It's just not something that I think about as heavily. In some cases, there are things that I appreciate that like are gendered. So maybe like the way a woman looks or like certain body parts or whatever. But then in other ways, there are things where I don't necessarily care as much about the gender. So if I'm being totally honest, I hate this fucking expression, but I probably wouldn't be bisexual. I'd probably be considered pansexual, but I feel like everybody that calls themselves pansexual is a fucking fedora tipping like hardcore lefty, so I don't use that term. But like, so like I could have a sexual interaction with like any trans person or like a male or female or a non-binary person, and it, you know, it would depend on like what the circumstances were in the scenario. Like I don't, when I go to consider like a sexual interaction with somebody, like their gender or sex is never like a consideration for me. That's not usually something I'm thinking about, you know?
Right. I've heard some people try, and I mean, maybe I shouldn't say try, but I've heard some people define bisexuality as a sexual attraction to their own gender, and like that, like that's one, and then the other is just all others. I've heard that. Yeah, it doesn't seem quite to fit with the historical interpretation, but maybe it's accurate, and certainly people can identify with that description, and it sounds like you do.
Maybe, yeah. Something else that man, everything is so much easier when you're younger or when you don't think about anything. That sounded really tip-tippy. I don't mean to make it sound that way, but like something else that I used to believe in hardcore, and we even get taught this in school, is I used to very much believe in like nature versus nurture. That's something that like it's drilled into you so much. And when I started to get more into like the race and IQ and debating the the alt-righters and everything on this, diving into like the more biology side of things and realizing that like this distinction is basically non-existent, or like it exists, but it's so much more complicated than just nature versus nurture, right? Like every gene expresses itself in an environment, and just like learning about how genes can be turned on and off, and all the complicated, like, God, fuck, like everything. Yeah, there's just like, there's no easy, simple answers for even like, even things that I before confidently, even being left-leaning, it's like, okay, well, I can confidently say like sex-wise, like male versus female, this or this or this. Like everything seems to be so highly dependent that it becomes really hard for you to make any absolute statements about like human behavior or like sexuality or anything, because everything seems so dependent on everything else around it, which is really frustrating me. Because I think it's very human. Like you want to be able to order things like, oh, well, this goes in this slot and this goes in this slot, and yeah.
That's actually something that, as a scientist, I deal with just day in, day out. Like, okay, yeah, I just read this paper. It's super convincing, and I'm sure of this fact at this moment. But then I'm like, well, hang on, because I'm just looking at this study and this evidence, and yeah, it does seem convincing. It does seem like that's what's going on. But it's possible that there's some other evidence out there, and sure enough, there is. There's always sort of competing evidences, and even on things which are comparatively small world and simple with hopefully very few variables. Like that's kind of the ideal of science, is to limit the number of variables and then just change one and see what happens. But even in those cases, you can still say, well, yeah, okay, we found like maybe a correlation between changing this variable and changing, let's say, the behavior of a neural network. But do we really know that that's the cause? Or do we know, is there some other causal feature or structure that is making this happen? Maybe this variable is just pulling the lever of something more deeply causal, or more proximally causal, let's say. And so, yeah, I think these problems exist all the way down, and then ultimately you can fall into solipsism anyway. So I think at some point you've just got to say, okay, in practice, I treat like a threshold of evidence as this, and I can be more and less confident of some things, but for the purposes of my belief system and acting in the world, I'm going to accept that this threshold is here.
Yeah.
And in science, we arbitrarily set this at p equals 0.05. I don't know if you
the p values and everything.
Yeah, but that's completely arbitrary. That was like most people say it's a significant result, a publishable result even, if your p-value for like distinguishing between whether something's significant or non-significant is less than p equals 0.05.
Yeah, I've read problems with like p hacking, and some people saying that the p-value isn't even good where it's set at, and
yeah. And really the value of 0.05 just came from an offhand remark from a plenary lecture at a statistics conference in the early 1900s, where someone asked, what should we consider significant, do you think? And apparently the speaker just had an offhand remark, about 1 in 20, if it happens in 1 in 20 times, and then that's where we get 0.05.
Yeah.
And it's crazy, to see how much that influences, like, so I mean, even though that's a continuous variable, right, and that should tell us basically something about how likely is it not to be true, but how likely is this to happen due to chance. Even that stability is often lost. But we as humans want to make it discrete and say, if it's below this value, yeah, it's true. And then if it's above, then maybe it's not. So
I think one of
I
the
think that,
things, or go ahead.
sorry, I'm just going to say, yeah, I'm just validating your feeling.
Mhm.
It's a human thing.
It feels kind of weird, or it feels a little bit unfair, especially in the realm of like philosophy, which I imagine when you get to certain levels of science, you have to begin to like do philosophical investigations anyway, in terms of like, well, what am I doing, right? At some point you have to ask that question. It feels a little unfair that like more and more investigation leads to more questions that sometimes feel a little unanswerable. And it's like,
Right.
why did I had a question about something fundamental, and now that I've
Yeah.
spent all this time investigating it, now everything just feels so like queer to me, and I don't know what happened. Like I didn't come here for this. Like, wait, this is the opposite reason. Something
Yeah.
that
Exactly.
something you mentioned earlier that I get so nervous because I catch myself doing this and I start to wonder,
Mm,
like when sometimes I'll think of something and I'll be like, this probably isn't causal. This is probably correlated. And then I start to
mm,
wonder, do I believe in any causation at all? And I wonder if that correlation shit is doing way too much work. So for instance, like, well, like women choose one thing and men choose another. Well, now, is it actually women choosing it, or is it something that's causing women to choose it? And it's like, okay, well, it's probably the way that parents are raising their children are causing them to do it. Well, do parents actually raise their children that way, or is something causing them to do it? And it's like, well, hold on, is it actually this, or is this all stemming from like, there's this like tangent, this ancillary variable that's actually influencing all these things? Like, well, but is that thing? And then I wonder at some point, it's like, do I actually think that anything causes anything at all? Because I feel like, and I actually feel this way sometimes, especially because I argue with so many people about so many things, like capitalism causes racism. It's like, well, no, I think that they stem from other things. Or, like sexism causes women not to do this. Like, well, no, I think then I start to wonder, like, do you ever believe in anything causing anything ever? Or I feel like I'm constantly saying, well, actually there's some other like unknown, like X variable that's like causing
right.
everything. I don't know if I ever talk about that random causal thing of everything. I feel like I'm always saying that things are correlational. And I don't know if I believe anything causes anything, and it's very
Right.
frustrating.
I fundamentally believe in causation. Of course, causation
Of
exists
course,
because
yeah.
yeah. And so I think maybe perhaps it's helpful to you is to think about it in scales. Like in the
Hmm.
local scale, of course, I can cause my arm to move by thinking about it, or I can, push over a book or change the position of a glass or something.
Hmm.
Um, so I can cause those things in the local level. Now, if I scale up to like if I'm living in a household, let's say, and I moved a glass and put it on, some place, but it was put in the original place that I moved it from by someone else, then you could say, well, was I caused to move it by this other person putting it there?
Hmm.
So you could say, yeah, maybe. And then you can just slowly increase the scales and then look at the causation. I think you can yeah, at bigger and bigger scales, maybe it becomes harder to detect the causation,
Hmm.
but at smaller scales, I think we definitely can.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I consider myself like a hardline determinist. So I
Okay.
agree in terms of like everything has a causal chain. But I guess
Mm,
like you've used the word compatibilism a few times, so I'm scared of using it because I don't know if I'm using it a different way. But like I
sure.
would say that I'm compatibilist and that like I'm a hardline determinist, but I acknowledge that like not all types of choices are equal. So for instance, I would be a hard determinist, and even at the end of
Mm,
the day, you're going to choose what you're going to choose. I would say somebody putting a gun to your head and making you do something is different than like all of the prior variables in your life when you do something. I say that we can say meaningfully that there's a difference between these two things, even if really there's not. Um, something
could
that,
you
or go ahead.
sorry, expand a bit on that? I didn't quite catch your meaning.
Oh, sure. Okay. So the way that I use compatibilism, or the way that I've heard compatibilism used, is in a moral sense.
Mm,
It seems to me, now I've never heard an escape from this, other than people that want to like quote quantum mechanics, which doesn't get you free will anyway. That I don't think there's an escape for saying that everything is kind of like determined. Like causality seems to be a pretty big thing, and to say that we make any choice, like free will choice, that's like independent of our prior causation, is I don't know how you can ever justify that without bringing in magic or religion.
mhm.
So if we believe in that, we lose our ability to kind of like be treated as moral agents, or to make statements about whether an action, like, can we really say that anybody did something good or bad if like everything was just because of all the prior causes? It seems like it's unfair to
Yeah.
blame somebody. So I think
Okay.
that philosophers wheeled out this thing ethically called compatibilism, and the idea is like, okay, sure, I recognize that determinism is real, and sure, but we can probably speak meaningfully about the different levels of choices that people make. So somebody
Yeah.
holding a gun to your head and forcing you to do something is going to be different than you on your own accord acting and doing things, even if it is all predetermined. Is my understanding of it.
Mm, Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's fundamentally a good understanding.
Hmm.
Compatibilism, I think the way you're using it might be yeah, of course, it's applied in moral settings, but I think it might be stemming from philosophy of mind, like a compatibilist view of free will and determinism. So
Okay.
yeah, I think that's a little bit more technical what you mean, because what you're trying to say is that, and just in general, philosophy and even scientists use this word compatibilism to just try to say that, yeah, I mean, it's you can just use the word and say, okay, I'm trying to make this idea compatible with this idea, and this is my theory for doing so. So, in terms of free will and determinism, there are some people who identify as compatibilists about those things, and they say, um, you know, just because we can see that basically everything is determined, we will accept some common notion of free will, and we'll make those things compatible with. Then there's many different frameworks for doing that, and some people will disagree about the acceptance of those or validity of those. But ultimately, that sort of compatibilism is, I think, what for example, most Western justice and judicial systems accept.
Sure.
We identify that people have some personal responsibility and some free will, but we also recognize that there can be other causes for their actions which
Yeah.
might mitigate
And you have
that.
to,
So
this compatibilism is necessary to have any non-absurd discussion about human behavior, right? The analogy that I draw is to discussing like fiction. Do you know like what Harry Potter is?
I know what Harry Potter is, yeah.
Yeah, so like if I were to ask like why did Snape kill Dumbledore, it would be very unsatisfying for somebody to say because that's how J.K. Rowling wrote it. Okay, well, you're not really answering the question, right? Like that, you know what I mean? Like I'm being compatibilist in my approach to Snape as a character. I know it's fiction and it was written a certain way, but I guess it would be similar in life. Like, well, why did he kill that person? It's like, oh, well, obviously every single antecedent cause that led up to his coming to this area in his life means that if he was always going to kill that person, almost like Minority Report. It's like, okay, well, that's not very satisfying to me. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way,
Oh, go ahead.
when you use satisfying, then what did you mean? Like psychologically satisfying or
Yeah, psychologically satisfying. It's not, yeah, when I say satisfying, it feels like very unintuitive and unacceptable. Like I don't think a normal human would accept that as an answer. It's very unsatisfying, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough.
This is a kind of a weird thing. So when I was 16, 17, I slowly evolved into an edgy atheist. I used to be very religious. I became a hardline determinist. I thought of this very kind of weird thought experiment a long time ago, and I never had like a satisfying resolution to it. But it feels like the answer must logically follow. If you were to invent, out of nowhere, if you were to invent a perfectly symmetrical dog, okay? A 100%... A 100% symmetrical dog, left and right side of its body was completely identical and had absolutely no prior experiences. And then you equipped it with all of the necessary tools and foundations and functions to live and survive and all of that, okay? If you took this dog and you put him in a room and he was hungry, and you placed like a bowl of equal distance to the left and right of him, 5 feet apart, and you filled it with food, would the dog necessarily starve to death? Or how could the dog ever choose between left or right if there's no reason for him to do so? Is there like a satisfying answer to this, or?
Well, I suppose, are you saying it's symmetrical at the time of conception, or it's symmetrical at all times? Like
What I'm saying, I'm just saying this to escape any dumb answers of like, oh, well, if the dog like has a longer leg on his left body, then he'll go towards the right bowl, right? I'm just saying that assuming there's like no preference for one bowl or another, how does the dog ever make a choice to go left or right, or does it necessarily just stand there and starve to death?
I think it just picks one based on noise.
What does that mean, though?
So, like, in the brain, we have ongoing it's called spontaneous activity, and this activity is just kind of like most people will identify as noise. People think, and I think it's well accepted, that there is some signal that's existing there, and this spontaneous activity changes dramatically in sleep. That's how we identify different sleep cycles, and as opposed to wakefulness. And this activity is somewhat kind of random, let's say, or noisy. Maybe neurons have to fire just because they do. Like if they don't every once in a while, then they'll die, let's say. We're not sure exactly why, but anyway, if that's the case, then whatever time that you take this symmetrical dog, even though it's biologically, physically exactly the same on both sides, unless you also want to say that it's exactly the same in its spontaneous activity in the state of all of its neurons on both sides at the moment you put it down, then I guess the dog will have a spontaneous activity which just randomly makes it pick.
I guess that's what I'm trying to avoid when I say symmetrical, because obviously there could be some underlying physiological phenomena, yeah, that could give rise to a decision one way or another. But absent
Right.
all of that, assuming that there wasn't some chaotic thing, right? Would the donkey just stand and starve to death?
Well, I mean, you might have just set that up in such a way that's necessary if in every single possible, like if I want to bring in any sort of sense of randomness, because I think that's the only way that I can explain it,
Yeah.
like any sort of noise or randomness, if you want to say that all of those are impossible, then maybe it goes for both. I don't exactly know what the behavior would be or if it would stand still.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah. But ultimately, in reality, I think that there's randomness, noise that happens not just in the state, but also the physiology, and even if you had two symmetrical.
Yeah, you in practice you never end up with this because of for a whole
Yeah.
host of reasons, right? We don't even need to get into the random noise, right? You're gonna have a genetic preference for one side. There's gonna be unevenness and anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. I haven't heard of something like that before. Um,
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I just
it,
the
it
whole.
kind of,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, it kind of reminds me of actually Derek Parfit's um, faulty transporter, or what do you call it? Like teleporter
Oh fuck.
machine. Have you heard of that?
I haven't, but man, I had a whole host of horrible conscious thoughts after my big mushroom trip. And if it has anything to do with teleportation, it's probably I can guess where you're going, but hit me up with it. What do you got?
Okay. So there's this teleporter, right, that
Mm-hmm.
that sends people to Mars, and the way it works is, as some physicists, would have predicted, is that it completely destroys all the atoms and
Mm-hmm.
their relationships in one place, and then it recreates it in another.
Mm-hmm.
And we just happen to accept that this is teleportation.
Yeah.
But actually, one of the teleporters in this future has a fault in it,
Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately, the destruction is delayed by about 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But the recreation happens as it is
Mm-hmm.
as it's supposed to. So you get destroyed on Earth, and you quote unquote get created on Mars, and then you have a video call with this person, and it's kind of you to you, right?
Yeah.
You're both
You
symmetrical.
both think you're you as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Except one of you is going to go on existing and the other one isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a question of like personal identity, like
Yeah.
which one is the real you, and is there a you,
Mm-hmm.
to be sure. And I think most people intuitively say the real me is the one that's being destroyed, and that's really sad. And so on that basis, then Derek Parfit, asserts that personal identity relates to a physical embodiment of, like, a continuously physically embodying thing, and you can't just be teleported because it won't be really you in this. Pardon me, in this sense. So, but I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you have a different interpretation?
I have a really hard time with this. So I'm going to tell you a dream I had, and then how it relates to this. And it actually made me flip my opinion on abortion. It's so stupid.
Oh wow. So wait, what was your opinion on abortion before, and what is it now?
I used to be like 55% pro-life because I feel like the most consistent way to define a human being is at the moment of conception. It just feels like that's like the most consistent holistic answer that doesn't have any fuzz, and I like those types of answers, right? And now I'm like 52% like pro-abortion. If you want to abort it, fuck it.
Maybe not pro the abortion, but just pro the choice of abortion.
Sure, yeah, pro the choice of the abortion, yeah. Yeah, so I basically, long story short, I had a very weird dream that we were moving from area to area, and every time we moved up, there was like a flooding city, and every time we moved up to the next floor, there wasn't enough like space to keep everybody, like the farms and everything running, and we didn't have enough space to feed everybody. And I was a part of a team of people where every time we had to move up to the next floor, I was responsible for killing some number of people before we move up to make sure that there was enough room for everybody to survive. And obviously, for whatever reason, I always lucid dream. I don't know why. It's just something I've done since I can remember. And obviously, so being told to kill people that were innocent is not something that I generally enjoy doing. And I remember like I had a lot of discomfort with this, and I asked the I guess the commander, general, section commander, whatever the fuck. I was like, yo, like I can't just kill innocent people. Like this is really fucked up. Why would we do it? And he said to me, he was like, it's okay. We only kill them in their sleep, so it doesn't really matter because they're not experiencing anything. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, and I didn't really have an argument against it. I was like, oh, okay. But I remember waking up, and that feeling was very profound, as stupid as it
Yeah.
sounds. So going forward to the teleporter thing, so here's an issue, okay? If you teleport from one area to another, and you run into this problem where the original is not destroyed, right? You've got two copies that are created of you, correct? So
Right.
the original one is in this problem. It's obviously the person that remained in the original area because, you know, that person wasn't teleported, right? Let's say that you step into a dark room and that room is a cloning machine and it creates another clone of you, okay? But you have no idea who's being created because it's a dark room. You step into that dark room, a clone is created, and two of you step out. You can never determine which one of you is the original. There's literally no possible way to determine it because you're like who you are as a conscious experience is just like an ongoing experience that has some collection of memories and then a current set of like behaviors and whatever. And then so the final step of this, so it used to be like my level 1 thought is that like, oh, teleporting is awesome. That would be sick. I'd love to teleport around. And then the level 2 thing is like, okay, well, hold on. I don't want to be teleported around because I'm basically dying. If I get teleported, I'm being fucking killed. But then like my next level of thought is being teleported would be no different than falling asleep and waking up. Because if you fall asleep and you pause your conscious experience and you wake up, it might actually be the case that when I go to sleep every night, I'm actually experiencing death. Whatever my current experience is ends and it's essentially dying. And then when I wake up the next morning, kind of like a new conscious experience is taking over, which wouldn't really be unlike teleportation. So for instance, let's say that I go to sleep at night and somebody picks me up and carries me into the living room and sets me on the couch and I wake up on the couch. Or let's say that I go to sleep at night and I'm teleported to the couch, my original is destroyed and a copy is teleported onto the couch. Would there really be a difference in either case? Or more importantly, there might be a physical difference, but would I ever know? It seems like the answer would be no.
Yeah, I really like that last example there. I think that's very interesting. I think there's no way for the person to know.
Yeah.
The question might be for someone that witnesses that event, do they consider you the same? Like, is the identity of you maintained, irrespective of whether or not you were teleported or just transported by a human to the couch? I don't have a strong intuition telling me that that person would say that you are not you still. But maybe if you were teleported to the couch incorrectly and there was two of you, then and one of them got destroyed, or how about just take an extension of the teleportation thing. Let's say the couch is in the same room as the bed, and this person witnesses your body appearing on the couch and then 10 minutes later being destroyed on the bed. Then I think they could have a genuine question about which one is really you, and are you still existing?
Yeah. Although I think that, so for those types of things, though, I think that it's wholly uninteresting to think about like the actual physical manifestation of anything, right? Because what is you or what isn't you in terms of like, oh, well, here I have access to the physical data. I think that what this really draws out is the very frustrating fact that consciousness exists in some world that is wholly inaccessible to us. And even to some extent to myself. I don't even have access really to my own consciousness. I just kind of like experience myself through it. So whether or not I go to sleep every night and it's actually the last night of my life and I will die and somebody different that is exactly like me will inherit all of my memories the next day, if that were the case, I would never know. And more frustratingly, I would never be able to know. And more frustratingly than that, actually, it might not ever even matter. Because like I said, in the example of like going to sleep and waking up, if I was killed and replaced by an equivalent thing, whatever thing exists there is going to feel like it was me just as much as me when I wake up. And as long as that conscious experience is being paused, you get into some like very fundamental questions of like, what is like your identity, I guess. And it feels like all of the answers to that are inaccessible. I hate that word, but it just, it feels like you just can't know. Yeah.
That's interesting that you have that intuition. I suppose I feel that there's something to be said about personal identity, which Parfit is right about in this case. But I can't think of a good way to combat what you're saying right now, but it's certainly interesting. And I think you're right from the perspective of the ego, like the person. yeah, they if there's no way for them to know, then basically doesn't matter. But I think somehow it matters if there's an external observer to this, and if you sort of if you have, as I do, some notions of an objective reality, then it matters. Like there's an ontology that's important and an ontological difference. But I think
That's something I'd be so curious, especially with your field of research.
mm,
I So I don't even like to make that statement anymore. I would have a few years ago. The idea that there exists an objective reality, there may
mm,
be one, but it feels
mm,
like whatever reality exists, it is wholly inaccessible to me. I have some organs that I think,
mm,
conveys to me information about the outside world, but my
mm,
experience with everything is wholly constructed in the brain.
yeah,
Absolutely, right? No one can deny that. Everything
right.
about your perception of reality is completely and totally constructed in the brain. And then I've said like the drug experiences and disassociating from that and seeing how much I have like taken for granted like the construction of things. So you brought up something very interesting before, the idea that there might be different, we can almost call them pixels, that neurons that fire off in the visual and the V1 part of your brain, depending on where things are moving at. The idea of even like seeing things as fundamentally different objects or different pieces of matter, or like constructing that there are objects just based on what is really only a two-dimensional field of view that I have.
Mm,
Yeah, that is all like, yeah, the idea that like everything is kind of constructed in the brain. There's that fact. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to ramble. There's that fact, and then there's the combination of the fact that if we believe in like Darwinian evolution and everything, there is really no good reason to believe that our senses convey anything truthful to us, because in reality, our goal, or at least what we believe our goal is the goal of any gene is to just reproduce, to propagate itself. And it might
mm,
be the case that it is more advantageous, evolutionarily speaking, to confer like some information that's untrue to you, or to hide some amount of information because it's more reproductively advantageous, such that I don't even know if I should believe that my senses were designed to accurately convey the environment to me. Sorry, that was a lot. But
mm.
yeah.
No, that's good. And I think fundamentally, if I could summarize it, you're talking about the epistemology of things compared to the ontology of things. That is like how we can learn about things. That's the
Mm-hmm.
epistemology, and like our knowledge of things
Mm-hmm.
compared to the existence, the real ontology of things, the
Yeah.
reality of things. And you're basically saying, well, since we have limits in our epistemology and our personal experience, that it's necessary to constrain the ontology that we acknowledge to that constraint. Um, but it seems to me like you also don't fully accept solipsism, right? You do accept that we can have real experiences, or that this isn't completely fabrication in our mind.
So the way
Is
that
it?
I do this epistemically is I basically I just say I don't know, but in order to have any meaningful conversation, I just assume it to be true and then move from there. Because I don't want, because technically, because really my position is fundamentally is like playing the ultimate skeptic, which is boring
Yeah,
because who cares?
yeah,
Congratulations, like everything is absurd to you. Like way to go. Like you can't have any meaningful
yeah,
conversation. Like go kill yourself. Like why the fuck do you care about anything, right? But I don't live that way, right? Like obviously
yeah.
I behave in a sense that causality is real. I haven't thrown myself off any buildings. When I turn a key in my car, I expect it to start. Like yeah, I don't live in a way that is like ultimately skeptical. So it
Mm,
seems silly to have conversations that way. But when it comes to like actually justifying things,
mm,
yeah, like I'll live as though there's an external world and everything. But if somebody asked me, like, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat? Right? I have no fucking idea. I could be. There's no reason to expect one way or another that I am or am not, because why would I? I
yeah.
can't justify it. Yeah.
Yeah, but you notice that question was, how do you know if?
Mm-hmm.
So the operative word was no.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're right. Maybe it's not possible to know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't, set a belief, or operate as if something is or is not
Mm-hmm.
in an ontological sense. So um, the question, instead of how do you know, is like, you could just forward it to, is your brain in a vat? Or are you a brain in the vat? You could answer rightly, I don't know. Or you could state, actually, I'm not, or I believe I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe stating some sort of belief, but also that's mapping to some sort of ontology of things. And
Hopefully,
yeah,
but
yeah.
unknowingly.
Well, no, ontology in like, you could have different ontological frameworks. Like you could have an ontological framework which is saying all that exists are our perceptions,
Yeah.
and you could have like non-physicalist non-materialist ontologies.
Exactly. So my problem, so the challenge that I would have given you there that I don't like is for me to fundamentally say that ontologically I'm going to talk about, like I have a certain existence and this is, what it is like being me. And I will say that I believe these things. It feels like I open myself up to other ontologies that I would normally reject. So for instance, like some Christian framework that, says like, well, the fundamental nature of the universe is all divinely inspired by God. Right. And it's like, okay, well, this is ridiculous. You're so stupid. I'm like, oh, really? Is that true? And you believe that you actually exist independent of any God? You know that you're not a brain in a vat. You know that nothing has a reason. Like, why shouldn't I kill you right now? It's like, well, I don't think that's right. Really? Why not? Well, fuck. I guess I'm at the end of the day, I'm making some like very baseline assumptions, and I guess you are too. And now it almost does feel like I fell into some sort of absurdism because I can't make any statement because my foundational, like my foundationally epistemically, I'm making a big assumption and then moving from there, and then all of my ontology and everything is built on top of that. And if somebody else starts from a different place, all of the places that we're starting from feel like places that are like inaccessible to normal human thought. So we just make an assumption about it and then move from there, and that feels like it sucks.
Do you feel like there's a valid that in practice we can assign some validity to particular ontologies depending on how well they are sort of able to be mapped with epistemologies? So, for example,
No,
like, oh no,
no, I don't. I think
so
that
for,
it's, or go ahead.
no, you go ahead. I think.
I I want to be able to, and I understand that it's tempting to do that. But like, so something else maybe that I can appeal to, kind of in your, I mentioned earlier, you've seen kind of like the problems related to how like we can use AI to do things to figure out like end results for things, and those end results can end up being, we'll say, racist, even though the AI wasn't made by evil racist people that are right. But you can end up in a world where not only are you running all the experiments to figure out the answers, but you've kind of constrained the possible answers to such a case that you will always get the answers that you're looking for. So everything kind of makes sense and everything works in kind of like this circular manner. How do I know that my own human experience isn't also, particularly circular? Like, let's say that I exist in a room where, half the room is orange and the other half of the room is blue, and I've made some arbitrary rule to myself that I'm never turning my back. But I construct a million different experiments to study the color of the wall before me, and I measure everything before me, blah, blah, blah. But I have this one rule, and maybe I'm not even aware of it, that I can't turn around and look at the orange wall, behind me. I can come up with a billion different ways to prove that my entire existence is blue, but it's only because I'm working within like this narrowly predefined set of operating procedures that makes it such that, of course, that's always going to be my answer. But I might be missing something completely that just exists slightly beyond my experience that I can never know about, and I can't know about it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Have you always felt this way? Have you always had this belief?
Yeah, I think that since I turned like 17, 18, I became ultimately skeptical. I read some weird thing about existentialism and I vibed with it. But this is going to sound so stupid and maybe a little anti-intellectual. When I was like 16, I started to read a lot of Ayn Rand, and I completely fell in love with all of the objectivism shit. And it took me about a year after I got out of that. I was like, oh man, like I can't read adult philosophers because I'm such a stupid kid that anybody I read, I think I'm just going to believe all their shit. So I actually intentionally for like a few years, like stood away from reading anything in philosophy. It's like, I'm just going to believe whatever dumb shit I read, like fuck me. And I just kind of like thought about things, and I would write things down and reflect on it. And ultimately I fell into this like kind of like ultimately skeptical position. And I think I've just gotten more and more skeptical over time. The last kind of domain that I had of stuff that I believed in, I think, was being like a very strong materialist and physicalist. And then as a result of some random thing that was said during a vegan debate, I came out of it wondering, I started to think about something I said, and I was like, man, fuck, like I just talked to this Hegelian about like phenomenology and shit. And you know what? I don't know if I can ever see a conscious experience. And I know I believe in them, so I necessarily believe in something that's wholly immaterial. Well, fuck, if I believe in this immaterial thing, well, how much other immaterial stuff is out there, And then I thought of the like, what if there was a conscious experience happening over a human population? If it was, I would never be able to see it or observe it. I have no tools. I've got no way to experience. I've got no measure. I was like, well, fuck me. I'm fucked. The one tiny thing that I thought I knew for sure, I actually don't. And now I have nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think if you were able to overcome this sort of skepticism, you should submit your findings to the Journal of Philosophy, because it's should be groundbreaking. Because
of course,
it really ultimately what you're talking about, I think, is just solipsism at its core, or Rene Descartes' observation that the only thing that we can really be sure of is that we exist as a conscious experiencing thing.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, pardon me. I don't think yeah, I don't think that there's an easy answer, and ultimately, if that is like, because if I think most people, as far as I know, most philosophers will accept basically what you're saying, and yet when we go out into the world, when we have conversations about mandatory voting or other things,
Hmm.
we just completely flip a switch and we act as if all the things we're talking about exist and that
Yeah.
our logical approach is logical and so on. Um, so I'm not sure, yeah, what to really do about that disconnection other than just to live with it and
Hmm.
accept that the world is messy and ultimately can't be fully justified in all possible deepest manners.
Yeah.
Um, but at least as an experiencing thing that is going to accept that other experiencing things exists, I try to at least adopt some sort of thing like I was talking about with the pro-social insects and the neurons in the brain, just noisily make a decision at my local level and like with the people I interact with and so on, and find agreement and common ground, and then through that
Hmm.
come to some sort of hopefully overall good opinion on things, and even though it's based on potentially faulty ground epistemically.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's just kind of something that just kind of was disappointing to me is that I kind of felt like a long time ago when I started to do more kind of dives into like philosophical ideas or content or whatever. I guess I was hoping at some point to come away with something a little bit more solid. But then like you look at ethics and people are more or less still arguing the same shit they did 2,000 years ago. It's not like I don't think we're ever going to read a paper like breakthrough ethics solved. Like it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's arguably one of the most important things in our lives. You know, like what is goodness on a meta ethical level, right? Or how do we determine like what systems of right or wrong normatively we should follow? And it's like these are like some of the most important questions that we ask, and there's like no good
Yeah.
answer to any of these things. Like yeah,
Yeah.
fuck.
Yeah.
But
Although it is, I think to me it is interesting that independently, within independent cultures, societies, intellectual traditions,
uh-huh,
we do tend to arrive on the same answer for a few things, like
uh-huh,
suffering is bad in
yeah,
basically every culture. Um, and then, it's how do we operate from that axiom or that standard,
uh-huh,
and then, what does that lead us to make choices about in terms of ethics? I think those are the differences. But over the years, I think most of the world would accept that something like slavery is bad. Um, and of course, there's modern slavery, and there are still forms of hardcore slavery
uh-huh.
going on in the world. But I think, yeah, compared to 2,000 years ago, our ethics has developed. But I agree, it's very slow.
Yeah. I mean, I that gets into a much more. That's an interesting question of like, is moral progress like a real thing or whatever?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or
Mm,
is it just norms that developed for more stable economic reasons or biological, whatever?
uh-huh.
So.
But
Anyway, it sounds like
yeah,
we've covered a lot of ground.
yeah, sorry, yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, I look forward. I hope in the future, something that I'm kind of excited for is when AI becomes sufficiently complicated. I wonder if that's going to push people to like really dive into thinking about some of these things a lot more too. I don't know
Mm.
if you've ever seen Her or
Yeah,
yeah, Cyberpunk. No, not Cyberpunk. Blade Runner 2048 or
I haven't seen.
uh, Ex Machina.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same.
like all of these all of these films kind of like challenge the idea of like what is a person or human or thing that's worth giving moral consideration to, and it
Yeah,
really feels like humans. It feels like humans are very easily like I don't know. It feels like there was so much obsession in my early youth, like the Turing test and all this shit. It was like it feels like humans are pretty easy to trick that something is living given like sufficiently, complicated AI, and not even like super complicated, but like yeah, I really wonder how people are going to interact with those things in the future. It's just like an AI that like communicates with you on a daily basis is probably going to feel more human to you than like a person on the other side of the globe, especially if they live differently than you. So it'll be
yeah,
interesting to see how all that turns
yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah. And theoretically, those AIs could like, in the same way as kind of like buying algorithms on Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
they could sort of upskill themselves or in niche themselves to cater specifically to your belief of whether or not they are real.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, everyone might be tricked in a slightly different way, or more easily tricked in a particular way, and so the AI could use that belief to its advantage and identify that belief and then operate based on that belief to try to trick you.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, actually, I just thought, and I might have to go soon. But I just wondered with what you said about maybe AI will lead people to have more consideration of more things in the world. Sorry. Do you think that could lead, or is that kind of leading you to think that animals have some moral consideration or worth?
Not really. It's just not. Yeah. So part of this weird thing that it's so strange. I spent all this time reading all this dumb shit about philosophy, and the basically the world I'm at now is like honest to God, like most of my systems are basically like you have an end goal in mind, and
Mm.
I'm just gonna like design a set of axioms that intuitively delivers me answers that I like. That's honest to God,
Right.
and it sounds silly to put it that way because it's like, okay, so your entire moral system is basically reductive to some intuitionist thing. But the thing I argue is that it feels like basically everything in existence does that.
Mm.
Not to bully any not to bully any, or I hope any math people don't get tricked. I figure you've studied like a fair amount of math, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So like, are you oh God, okay. I'm so sorry if I butchered the fuck out of this. So have
No,
you?
I sent you that email about axiomatic systems a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
I imagine. Oh God, I don't mean to ever talk down or whatever. I'm sure you know all this way more than I do. Are you familiar with like the original challenges? I think in the early 1900s, like naive set theory and shit, right?
Yeah.
And then we got like ZF, the Zermelo Frankel shit out of that. And it
Yep.
seems like even when you look at that, like what in terms of asking, like, well, what's correct? Like why is a paradox presented to some set theory better? And it's like, well, the reason why we constructed the axioms for the Zermelo Frankel stuff is just because, well, this is just kind of what we want to do math. And it's not like now, I mean, like maybe in a physics sense, you can argue like, well, math tends to map onto the world and blah, 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 blah. But it seems like we basically construct systems because we want them to do the things that we want them to do. And that feels very circular and weird to me. And I kind of wonder if like moral and everything for humans is the same things. I don't know. Like it all feels like really is everything just like some circular reductive shit at the end of the day. Like I don't know. Sorry, I'm really in these deeper levels of I don't normally talk about this, but in the deeper levels of shit, I'm very much like very lost in this like ultimately skeptic land of like nothing is real and everything is circular and everything is fucked and yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, in that email that I just mentioned to you, I think I was mentioning that, yeah, there are axiomatic systems which are complete and consistent,
Mm-hmm.
and that you can do reasonable things in them, but of course, it's limited.
Mm-hmm.
And so, actually, I think that's an interesting point that you're making is that, yeah, like humans, when they have a moral system or ethical system or political system, whatever, or just a system for understanding the world, they try to make it consistent, and they
Mm-hmm.
update their axioms or whatever with different observations. And then after that, they make sure that the axioms are somehow self-consistent and don't lead to inconsistencies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, you can have multiple different complete consistent systems account for the same set of facts, but they'll be different fundamentally in their axioms and how they operate.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different self-consistency. Um, and yeah, I think um, fuck, where was I going with this? Um, yeah, and so actually, I think the axioms that we develop in moral theories and so on, where or just belief structures about the world, are maybe worth accepting if we can see some consistency, some self-consistency. Although you can bring up that example that you brought up of what if I just don't turn around and see the orange side of the room,
Mm-hmm.
and then therefore not look at all the evidence. Uh, yeah, that's interesting.
Or not have the sense organ to see it, I guess, right? Like we think of like even colors are so arbitrary, right? Like even
Yeah.
yeah, it's like a wavelength that like a color doesn't really exist, right? Like there are wavelengths that are reflected by certain objects that aren't absorbed, and we just happen to be able to perceive a very small section of that spectrum, and we call it colors. And like, what if we didn't have eyes at all? Like how, like, would we say that if we didn't have eyes at all, would we say colors exist? Probably not. But then like, is there some other quality out there that exists for some other thing that we're, I don't know. Fuck all of that shit. I don't want to play video games and blow things up in space. Yeah, fuck. Yeah, it's all of the philosophical investigation has led me to like deep. I'm going to use that word again. Deeply unsatisfying things of like the Yeah, it's like learning how to swim, and then you like learn how to swim, and then you swim into a whirlpool over and over again. It's like, oh well, this sucks shit. Like I'm just gonna go waddle in the kiddie section and be religious or something. Fuck.
Uh-huh. Maybe it feels like you're a bee that's flying, but physics tells you that, oh, how is this possible? And you don't understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, what? I don't know what time it is for you. If I'm like eating up all your.
No. I'm actually just super hungry because I woke up and I didn't eat, and it's now past lunchtime, so I better go eat.
All right. Well, hey, listen, I really appreciate the conversation. If you ever want to
nice.
chat about anything, shoot me a message, or if you want to talk about we talk about AI stuff sometimes, but all of that is really interesting. I think neuroscience in general gets a really bad rap because how people abuse it on the internet. So there's anything you want to talk about or anything. Anytime I hear like any evolutionary biology shit, I start to cringe like very quick, and neuroscience brought up a lot on all of it. So yeah.
Yeah, actually, I might actually reach out in that case because, man, it's so frustrating. As someone that knows some stuff, to see just nonsense be spouted is frustrating. So anyway, I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed. And your mission is to find like the King Seal, and what you find out is the King Seal sold his people down the road a long time ago because the evil corporos promised him a lot of money and pollution, and he wanted that, and he hates black people.